Mr. Rosen, thank you very much for taking some time. I do appreciate it.
My pleasure.
One of the things that we're interested in is where this passion for music comes from. And I know by just researching some of the things that you've done, you've got a lot of passion for music.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have a lot when you were growing up?
Yes, but my parents were not very musical people. I mean, some musicians come from a family of musicians, excuse me, but not so in my case. Neither parent were musicians, but my mother was a ballet dancer. So she had, I guess, some musical aptitude or musical sense, and perhaps that's where I got it. And then I just became very interested in music and drums, of course, as a kid, but played piano first. So my first instrument was not drums like most drummers. It was rather a vibraphone. So that's where I started, and then moved into drums.
Very interesting. Yeah. Where did you grow up?
Grew up in Philadelphia, northeast Philadelphia, and played a lot of jobs and some fraternities at University of Pennsylvania and Temple University when I was still in high school, and then was of course in the band in high school and things like that, and then went on to college where I studied with Charlie Owen who was in the Philadelphia Orchestra at the time at Temple University for 4 years. Played in many symphonies around the city, the Mainline Symphony and the Frankfurt Symphony, and there was at the time, and I think there still is, a good list of maybe 6 or 8 small symphonies in the neighborhood. I played a lot of those, and then went on to University of Illinois, where I studied with Jack McKenzie, and then went on to, after that, got a job in the Milwaukee Symphony. So I was in the Milwaukee Symphony for about 8 or 9 years, and then got a call from the Oberlin Conservatory asking me if I would like to teach there. And I auditioned for that job and got it. And it was kind of interesting because I remember when I first went there to Oberlin, I thought to myself, well, this would be a good place to practice and be waiting for the next job, perhaps in Boston Symphony or Philadelphia Orchestra, but found myself really enjoying 2 aspects of it. And one of them was getting into contemporary marimba music at the time, where I introduced lots of pieces, some of the newest pieces at the time. This was 1972, 3, 4, from Japan. And was the first one to bring Keiko Abe over to this country, and introduced many of those pieces that she had already played in Japan. I introduced them here. And the other aspect was teaching, just in general. And I found myself seeing teaching as an artistic outlet, a creative outlet, as much as performing was. But by the same time, was also performing solo marimba music, and I had a percussion ensemble to teach, and began to commission composers to write pieces for us, and I found pieces in Europe to bring over to this country. So I introduced lots of pieces that were from Europe as first performances in America, premiere performances, and also commissions of lots of pieces. So I found myself since 1972 when I came to Oberlin, and here we are 2008, and I'm still there and going strong and enjoying the students even more. It's funny how Oberlin, or college anyway, itself, hanging around with young people keeps you young, I think, in a way. They give you new ideas, they give you new perspectives on events, on music. They keep me stimulated, and I just think it's a fabulous place to be, a stimulating place, a university in general. It's a stimulating place to be.
So prior to going to Oberlin, did you have hopes of just continuing in the orchestra?
Yeah, that was originally my thought, was to go to Oberlin and just practice so that I could audition for the next job, and actually ended up never doing it because I just enjoyed teaching so much.
What were some of the aspects of teaching in those early years that really hooked you?
Well, in the beginning, I was just sort of going by what I had learned from my teacher, and the same methods that my teacher had taught me was Charlie Owen. And I found myself asking questions to myself about how do I get across something to a student. And it's kind of a fascinating problem, because here you are, you have one specific thing you have to get across to a student, whether it be improving their role, improving their time, expanding their ears to have be more attuned to timbres and to ensemble playing. And the question, of course, I have to ask is, well, how am I going to teach a student to do this? What am I going to do to get a student to respond to it? And one of the ways I did it was through experimentation and just using the things that I saw work. In addition to saying to a student, once when a student got something and got better at a specific thing, I would say, well, tell me, what is it did you do that made it better? What was it? What was the thing that made the difference? And as many times as it would be something I told them, they'll say, well, you told me to do such and such. As many times it was something where they said, well, I discovered that if I do such and such, it gets better. And found myself using that as the basis for my teaching, in that I would tell a student, you find the way. I will introduce you to some ways that I know. I will introduce you to a methodology, but you have to find your own way to do it. I often tell my students that the teaching goes on in the studio, but the learning goes on in the practice room. That's where a student hones their skills and discovers how to learn, because after all, that's what it's about. When you can teach a student how to learn, you make yourself obsolete, which I think is really the point of any teacher in any field. You're in a situation where you're in one-on-one, and it's just you and the student in the room, and you know more about that student than anybody else does in a certain aspect of their lives, and they rely on you for that. That's the way it used to be in all fields. There was the apprentice system, where anything from a plumber to a philosopher, a woodworker or whatever, any skilled laborer or worker would be in a apprentice situation where they would learn from the master. Well, that sort of disappeared now in many respects, and I think in music, the music field, and perhaps in the writing field, and there's a few fields that are that way, it's still alive, and I feel quite fortunate to be able to have that interaction with one student at a time and try to have them generalize the specific things I tell them and have them specify the generic or general rules about things that I tell them, and having them work it out their own way. And most students eventually get there, and they really understand it. So that was probably if you could say there was a revelation that happened with me with my teaching, and that was probably it, when I sort of discovered that, to let the student take over in a sense and guide them, and in some ways stay out of the way. It's an important thing, I think, to stay out of the way with certain students, and others you guide until you can kind of push them off out of the nest.
Well, which must be a very rewarding aspect of it all.
Oh yes, absolutely. I mean, that's what's thrilling when you see students. I have students in the Swedish Opera Orchestra, in the Liverpool Symphony, in the Cleveland Orchestra, in several orchestras all over the country, and students teaching at USC and other schools, and just jobbing maybe in New York and playing in shows. I have a student who's playing in shows on Broadway. So it really runs the gamut of all the professional possibilities. And I think that if you go to any school, I don't think you necessarily have to do everything. I think it's about the learning that makes you possible. For example, I have students who are doing hand drums. Probably one of the foremost hand drummers in the country today is Adam Rudolph, a student of mine. whose name is Adam Rudolph, I never taught him anything about hand drums, but he learned about music, he learned about style, he learned about commitment and passion from me, I hope, and by our interaction. And it doesn't have to be that I teach the specific thing of how to hit that thing. Of course, very important, but that's not the only thing about teaching that's important for me.
Have you noticed if students in general have changed over the years since when you first started to now?
Yeah, I've noticed that the students seem to know more about music. The students seem to be at a higher level. The pieces that they used to play when they auditioned when I first came to Oberlin are now considered high school pieces, or maybe even younger. So they're being exposed to better teaching, more music. And a lot of it is technologically based, obviously, because we have tapes and iPods and CDs and DVDs available to the students, and there seems to be more of a range of interest that students have. So I've noticed the students have generally gotten better and are more open to different kinds of music.
Very interesting.
Ah.
What was your introduction to PASIC? How did you get involved?
Well, when I was in the Milwaukee Symphony, and maybe even before, I joined the Milwaukee Symphony in '72, and I think the first PASIC I went to was 1971, if I'm not mistaken, and that was in Chicago. I could have the exact places or dates a little bit off, but that's when I went. And I remember seeing all the people who at the time were known as the experts in the field. I remember seeing William F. Ludwig Sr. at that thing. He was rather old at the time, but he was there, and I remember seeing him and meeting him. And Joe Jones was there, and other people who are sort of history now. And I got involved with the PAS perhaps a little bit later after I went to Oberlin, and then was on the board of directors for several years, and have been, for as long as I can remember, a member of the editorial board of the Percussive Notes magazine, where I have a continuing article called Terms Used in Percussion, where I have students write to me about, or professionals also write to me about a specific instrument that they're not sure of or what to use. And what I try to do is to make sure that not only do I define the instrument, but I also try to say to a student, to the readers, here's what the Concertgebouw Orchestra uses in Holland. Here's what the New York Philharmonic does for this instrument or for this specific piece. And that's been my major function. I've sort of found my place in the organization, the Percussive Arts Society, as everybody does. You know, there's never having have aspirations for being president. I was on the board for many years and realized that my best place was to stay in contact with the readership through editing articles that other people send me and generating articles from friends and associates and colleagues in other schools and other orchestras, and then editing them or giving them ideas about what I think. A lot of people I know are fantastic players but have never expressed themselves, and that's what I've tried to do in Percussive Arts Society, and I've sort of found my niche, so to speak. Yeah.
Now, how did the terms come about?
Well, when I was at Oberlin, my very first sabbatical, I applied for what was called a Powers Travel Grant at Oberlin, which was a grant to go to different places in Europe. You couldn't just go to one place, you had to go to several places. And I had all these instruments that I didn't know what they were. A tambourin provençal, a tambour de basque. What are all these instruments? I'm not really sure what they are. So I had 3x5 cards, hundreds of 3x5 cards that I took with me to Europe, to different orchestras. And I would go to France, and where I met a percussionist whose name is François Dupin. And I would take the card, go to his studio, take the card and put it on a music stand and say, okay, pick the instrument that you would use for this. So I didn't have him describe it. I didn't ask him to tell me what it is. I said, I want to see what you pick. And they would walk over to the corner and pick up this instrument, and I would write down in English what we would call that. Because sometimes they would just say, oh, it's a tambour. Yeah, what's that mean? Drum. It's just a drum. It's a generic term and doesn't mean anything in our language. And then I went to, it doesn't mean anything specific in our language. And then I went to Germany and talked with Christoph Kaskel, who was a performer for Stockhausen. He was Stockhausen's percussionist. Did the same thing in German. What is this instrument? And what would you use for Ruhrtrommel or Landknechtstrommel? And go show me what it is. And he'd walk over and pick it up. And then I would know what instrument to write down. And it just went that way. I did the same thing in Holland. I did the same thing in Spain. And then eventually got a sort of a little coterie of friends, colleagues who expect me to write to them when I get a letter from a student or a professional who says, what do I use in Parade by Satie? It calls for a strange instrument called a buteaphone. What's that? So I just got to be sort of, I guess, quasi-expert in that particular field. A lot of questions come up again, the same ones. But I have now over 7,000 or 8,000 3x5 cards. And someday I'm going to put them on computer. But I had them on computer, but one time, but then they keep changing the formats for the computer cards. So I finally said, I'm not going to do this until I know that there's a format in computers that is going to last, so I don't have to do it again. So I'm in the process of doing it, and perhaps someday I'm going to sit down and finish it. Meanwhile, I've written over 75 or 80, somewhere between 75 or 80 articles for the Percussive Notes magazine, all of which dealing with these topics, and they can all be accessed through the PS website, where they have past issues of and someday I'll get it all together.
What have been some of the more memorable things that you wrote about that come to mind?
Well, that's really hard to say. I mean, I don't have any specific things. I remember writing about the hammer stroke in Mahler 6, and several people sending me their ideas. The Concertgebouw Orchestra uses a giant box that looks like a timpani box, and they hit it. The Chicago Symphony used to use a huge 2x4 that they slapped on the floor. I used to use a sledgehammer that I used to hit on a piece of